This video is brought to you by Display, which make absolutely perfect Christmas gifts, and they have a sale on right now. Stick around to the end of the video to hear more about their stuff. This is version 2 of my Disco Elysium review. The first version was structured in such a way that it had major plot points revealed throughout the video. This video is 95% similar, but it's been edited to remove some spoilers and also provide advance warning and timestamps when I'm about to spoil something, allowing you to skip those sections. Note that I do spoil one or two minor plot details, but nothing so major that it would lessen your appreciation for this exceptional game. At the start of my recent Jedi Fallen Order review, I commented that it was possible to pull the game apart, lay its pieces down side by side, and argue that since each of those pieces were fairly mediocre, you could say that the game as a whole was pretty unremarkable. But I also said that doing that would be a waste of time because fully assembled and splashed with a thick coat of Star Wars paint, Jedi Fallen Order was a brilliant, cathartic adventure that Star Wars fans were sure to love despite the game's many shortcomings. The game did not invite any sort of deep analysis because it was never going for depth, innovation, or nuance. It was popcorn cinema, airplane fiction, the quintessential AAA game. Disco Elysium is a better, more ambitious, more thought-provoking, and more sophisticated game than Jedi Fallen Order could ever hope to be. This is a very special game that says a lot about how to write and deliver immersive storytelling and how to build and entrench deep pen and paper inspired RPG systems. Critically, Disco Elysium provides a template for making the point-and-click adventure game relevant again for a new generation of gamers, picking up a torch lit by LucasArts, carried forward by Telltale, and left to flicker out with Telltale's collapse under mismanagement. Disco Elysium is one of the best games of the year, and certainly one of the most important, and it's for this reason that I'm going to be going very deep in my analysis and critique of it. The criticisms that I offer aren't intended to paint Disco Elysium as bad or unworthy of your time. It's quite the opposite, in fact. I think Disco Elysium is so good that it will cause significant ripple effects across the RPG and adventure game landscape. With an impact as far-reaching as this is sure to be, I think the point of origin demands in-depth analysis in a way that a game like Jedi Fallen Order simply does not demand. I'll finish this prelude by saying this. I did not love Disco Elysium, but I respected it immensely. I do not want to play it again, but I want to play games much like it in the future. In this review, I'll explain why.
There is nothing, only warm primordial blackness. Your conscious ferments in it, no larger than a single grain of malt. You don't have to do anything anymore.
More than perhaps any other game I've ever played, Disco Elysium seems to cast a spell on you.
Ever. Never, ever. An inordinate amount of time passes. It is utterly void of struggle. No ex-wives are contained within it.
You feel hypnotized by it, paralyzed in its tractor beam as it pulls you into its world. The lizard brain and limbic system dialogue at the start of the game is the perfect showcase for this. The lizard brain's voice is so alluring and reassuring, yet it's unquestionably evil. Its tones and timbre belie someone or something that means you harm, but his honeyed words seem to soothe and lull you into acquiescence. It's almost predatory, like an anglerfish in the distance beckoning you forward.
Alright, nothing down to fuck all borough.
What this sequence does is put you, the player, in your own head. The words you see and hear are the scaffolding, but they are delivered so expertly that they immediately demand your imagination finish the construction. Who is this voice and why does he sound this way? Is he separate from me or a part of me? What is the lizard brain anyway? Should I trust it? Why does it seem like I'm about to die? Am I about to die? If I die, is it game over? We cannot help but be pulled into these thoughts the moments the lizard brain begins speaking and we begin interfacing with him through our choices. We are given so much inspiration but so little information, and we're forced to imagine the whole so that we can begin problem solving through its smaller parts. This carefully apportioned trickle of information is the defining characteristic of Disco Elysium's writing style. We awaken in a ransacked bedroom, near naked, clearly hungover and suffering from amnesia. We know immediately we're a fuck up. But how much of a fuck up are we? We know we're there for a reason, but is that reason connected to our lack of clothes? Our imagination runs wild as we do something as simple and mundane as getting dressed and stepping outside. There's a dreamlike quality to this world's characters that adds to its hypnotic essence. The first woman you meet seems otherworldly in her indifference. Same with the cafeteria manager downstairs. Kuno outside couldn't possibly be real. He's too foul-mouthed and he refers to himself in the third person. Meeting the union boss feels like holding court with Jabba the Hutt. Measurehead speaks in a way so unnatural it sounds like machinery.
Fungus is deep within your nervous system, pulling the strings. You are merely its pupa now. I see no hope for you or your kind.
Surely none of these people could actually exist. Surely we must be in a dream to encounter so strange a cast of characters. The art style the game has adopted gives visual manifestation to the dream state we find ourselves in. The character stats are all represented by hugely abstract and sullen works. There's a Rorschach-like quality to them that leaves them open to interpretation, but there's also an implied suffering in each of them. None of them communicate a sensation of empowerment or control. Each of them look as though the subject is either in pain or so removed from reality that they couldn't process pain at all. The art behind the thought systems are even more confronting. Surrealist art that has a grotesque quality to it. You have to study it for some time before the linkages to its subject become clear. The time spent peering into these works to decipher them is just as much about activating your imagination as is the incomplete dialogue. What makes Disco Elysium feel so ethereal is the ease with which it moves between minutiae and vast idealized thoughtscapes. In one moment you're pondering your identity as a hobo cop, imagining all the benefits of living on the street, and the next minute you're grappling with the history of communism, its founder, the mysteries of his suicide, and reflecting on how to resurrect the communist movement today. A slave to your addiction, you're cheek down on a bar counter, slurping up spilled liquor, and then suddenly you're internalizing advanced race theory as a means of making sense of world history and what's to come. Completely deluded, myopic self-interests sit unperturbed side by side with revolutionary political ideology. In a single instant, the game can serve you up wildly disparate ideas, and yet they all fit. Disco Elysium is unconcerned with how big or small an idea might be. Instead, it's the extremity or obscurity that helps ground them in the universe. Indeed, dull, centrist ideas feel rather out of place in Revachol. When the game so freely weaves together and between the extreme and the absurd without reference to scale, relevance, or believability, its character comes to mirror that of a fever dream, or at least a dream belonging to a restless night's slumber. The composition of the world further displaces you in both time and space. Temporally, Revachol exists in between time. Post-Soviet collapse, pre-steampunk revolution, futuristic motor carriages and radio signal multiplayer games, analog phone lines and future tech ceramic armor. Physically, Revachol is such a strange polyglot of different races, political ideologies, identities, age groups, social groups, class castes, and cultures. It has a distinctly Tower of Babylon feel to it, as though too much difference was piled on too high on too small a square mileage. The same way a dream can meld from one instance or person or reality to another, so Revachol seems to meld as we cross from one building or street to the next, next, completely different in contents, form, and function. With so much inconsistency pulling at the seams of reality, the game goes to great lengths to give the player handrails should they seek them. As you walk through Revachol, prompts will tell you what you are seeing and hearing to ground your 5 senses. At various points, you can stop and admire landmarks or simple post boxes, engaging them in a way that reminds you that the world you're in mimics the real world in more ways than one. It's the in-depth expository dialogue that grounds the player the most though. Just as you can stop at a landmark and examine it, you can stop at any person you see and explore the world through their eyes. There are no solely transactional interactions in Disco Elysium, where an individual exists only for the sake of specific utility or progression. No NPC who will simply open a door for you when you present them a key, or transact with you when you need items. Every character you meet is a window into the world. The cafeteria manager shows us how much commerce has been lost in Revachol during its decline. The lorry drivers show how subtle racism can be found everywhere. The bookshop owner shows us a picture of optimism and hope in a town that no longer has any. The wealthy Wild Pines appointee shows us the omnipotence of capital, and the union boss shows us how organized labor can be just as much a puppet of capitalism as its enemy. Some of these insights sit at the surface, while others are buried deep in the dialogue options you'll be presented with. You don't have to explore the world through its people, but if you choose to avoid that, then there's no doubt at all that Disco Elysium is not the game for you. This is an experience that is designed to get your synapses firing through its vivid imagery, its wildly believable and unbelievable exposition, its rapid oscillation between the mundane and the profane. Should you choose to avoid all of this world building, your mind is just left to languish over trivial details like how frustrating it is to traverse space, how dull the murder mystery itself is, and how thoroughly disappointing the ending turns out to be. Just as the stick insect secretes a fluid that slowly infects the subject's mind, driving them to a sort of madness, so Disco Elysium words seep into your mind and rewire it without your permission. It's a rare experience that can create and maintain this half-asleep, half-awake space in which Disco Elysium resides. Reality is so sharp. Disco Elysium feels decidedly gelatinous. Its physical, auditory, and textual presence all seem to mirror the abstract art that adorns its RPG systems. It's its own waking dream, the likes of which you'll either fully embrace or bounce off of for the effort required to get there. Like dreams, Disco Elysium isn't bothered by tangents, non sequiturs, or word counts. One area in which Disco Elysium has received universal praise is in its RPG design. I want to echo a lot of this praise, but I also want to push back on some of it, since I've found the utility of these systems far less elegant and meaningful than the design work that's gone into them. Disco Elysium's character creation and RPG framework is confronting. The player is immediately thrust into a great and unwieldy grid of over 24 different skills aligned to 4 major stats. For the video game playing public, the stats of intellect, psyche, physique, and motorics are somewhat familiar ground, and we can feel our way towards which one is going to best support our playstyle. It's in reviewing the skills that things become far less familiar. The nomenclature itself is obscure. We understand that logic might help us deduce things, but what is conceptualization? What is inland empire? What is esprit de corps? And should I put points into it? As impressive as these names are, they often don't make clear what exactly it is you're specializing into when you invest points there. The next layer down are the descriptors, but these are even less helpful. We see that esprit de corps allows us to connect with Precinct 41 and understand cop culture, but what does that actually mean? Is that good? Encyclopedia. Call upon all your knowledge, produce fascinating trivia. Is that helpful to me, or is that just fun? Inland Empire reads, hunches and gut feelings. Okay, that sounds useful to a cop. It goes on, dreams in waking life. Okay, what the fuck is that? In the previous version of this video, I simply did not know that there were info tabs present that further elucidated the meaning behind these skills. The info tab describes how these skills will impact your playthrough at both high and low levels of stat investment, though even these descriptions cannot fully communicate the full meaning of a skill since you haven't seen the full gameplay loop play out yet, and you can't grasp how the system of stat checks and dice rolls can be influenced by these character-forming choices. Most confusing of all is the overlap inherent in so many of these skill names and their descriptors. Logic allows us to deduce things, but does not logic require a degree of conceptualization in order to exist? How is logical deduction different from visual calculus, since the latter is simply the mathematical form of logic? The descriptors for rhetoric, authority, suggestion, drama, and half-life all make clear that these skills increase your ability to influence the will of others. Do we really need 5 skills that achieve this singular gameplay outcome? The natural conclusion we might arrive at when viewing the character creation process is that it's one that has a pretty strong chance of confusing the player. It has a huge amount of skills, counterintuitively named, and with lots of potential overlap between them. We might ask why the developers didn't arrive at a smaller, leaner RPG framework that communicated itself more easily to the player. But there's an entirely different way to look at this character creation process, and I think it's a much better reading. Were I not currently reading a history of Napoleon the Great, I wouldn't have known what esprit de corps meant, roughly translates to the spirit or morale of a unit, such as a military company or a police precinct. I had to Google the meaning of savoir-faire, and I learned that it means something akin to adaptability. As I pondered the potential overlapping terminologies of each label and descriptor, I had to engage my knowledge of these words and how they were distinct from one another. At this early point, I was beginning to build in my own head a map of the game's systems, since these terminologies form the bedrock of the game's RPG. Rather than spoon-feed this knowledge to me, the game spoke to my intelligence and logical deduction, immediately putting me into the mindset of a detective, where things are rarely clear-cut and everything must be solved for. The truth is, understanding this esoteric RPG terminology is one of the game's mysteries, and it's one that you cannot hope to solve here in the character creation screen. Modern games development, particularly AAA games, have a strong focus on front-loading explanation to reduce player friction and increase the chance that they will immediately grasp gameplay systems. Games of old were far more comfortable knowing that the player will discover the nature of the game systems for themselves. Truth be told, I still can't tell you the exact definitions of many of these skills, since I did not invest heavily enough into them during my playthrough, and I could not see their impact manifest notably enough. Many, though, I now can tell you what they mean. I can tell you that Encyclopedia will interject with useful or useless information at random points, either to flesh out the world or simply bury you with information. I can tell you that empathy will not only allow you to sense the pain of others, but allow you to make that pain your own should you put too many points into it. And I can tell you that visual calculus pertains specifically to the mathematical and geometric properties of events, where logic pertains more broadly to causality in sequence or argument. I came to these understandings through the process of playing the game and feeling the impact of these skills, not through tutorial tooltips or training levels. It took me a very long time to grasp all of this, but I felt as though I was in dialogue with the game's systems during my playthrough, and the satisfaction of unmasking their true nature came in small releases, just as my progress in the murder mystery did. I'm solving many mysteries at once in Disco Elysium. How the game itself works is one of them. The final point about the bloat and duplication inherent in the skills is another one I took some time to reconcile with, but I'm pretty happy with where I landed, and here's what I think. In games with a combat framework, we never say, what's the point of a fireball if I have a sword to accomplish the same end? We are conditioned to understand that combat should provide us with a variety of different options to achieve the singular objective of dealing damage. Yet when it comes to non-combat outcomes, such as speechcraft craft, or stealth were typically used to single stat points or skills. We put points into the dialogue stat to make us more effective in conversation, or the sneaking stat to improve our subterfuge. Rarely are these stat areas subdivided into more nuanced RPG stat systems. If they are, there is typically a moral lens placed over them. Are you a smooth-talking good guy who appeals to people's better angels, or are you a belligerent oaf who browbeats and intimidates your counterparts into submission? Disco Elysium's skills are full of overlap because they should be. In real life, you can convince people with logic, and you can overawe them with rhetoric, and you can dramatically persuade, and you can exercise authority, and you can physically intimidate. All of these options are available to us when trying to convince or coerce someone, so why should these options not be available to us in-game? To play a game is to impress our will upon its potential outcomes. Why should that will be funneled so narrowly into specific, clearly delineated gameplay systems where more organic and borderless systems will present the player a more authentic means of expression? The true test of these systems is how they function in flight. They are smartly constructed, but are they utilized to full effect during a playthrough? I'd argue yes, but the value of these systems is held back by a static game world and a chronic lack of meaningful choice. The heart and soul of Disco Elysium is the dice roll. Traditional video game RPG design sets thresholds for skill checks. You cannot click on an option or equip a certain weapon or pick a certain lock if you haven't put enough points into the skills and stats that make those outcomes possible. It's binary, yes or no, possible or impossible. Disco Elysium embraces a pen and paper tabletop RPG approach where your stats are combined with a dice roll to produce outcomes. You might have a fairly high physical stat, but there's still a chance that your roll will fail and your combat maneuver will be ineffective if Lady Luck sides against you. I think embracing the dice roll in this way is brilliant. So few games do this, and it feels like something genuinely fresh in a video game, even though pen and paper role players have been doing this sort of thing for decades. Besides being novel, the dice roll creates a tension and an adrenaline rush that compensates for the game's lack of combat. There is no combat in Disco Elysium, at least not in the traditional sense, but the game is often simulating a combat-like feeling as you are regularly pushed to roll the dice, with the outcome having significant impact on everything from your player's identity to your progress in the investigation. Players keen to sidestep the negative impacts of failed dice rolls can of course game the system by save scumming, the practice of saving your game before a roll is initiated and then reloading your save if the roll doesn't go your way. It's actually possible to leapfrog over pretty much any skill in the game if you have the patience to exploit this vulnerability, but not only is this tedious, it also ignores the fact that the game has created incentives for the player to embrace negative roll outcomes. In pen and paper RPGs, there's typically a dungeon master whose job it is to provide the overarching narrative for the adventure, as well as the gameplay framework, such as telling people when to roll and against which stats. One of the hallmarks of a good dungeon master is that they know how to keep things feeling interesting and rewarding no matter how the dice lands. Good dungeon masters are good storytellers, and they can spin a yarn from a failed dice roll just as easily as they can spin one from a good one. Video games don't do this, typically because they don't utilize roll systems at all, and secondly because failure conditions, like getting spotted while you're trying to stealth, often prove to be a nuisance rather than surprisingly rewarding. One of Disco Elysium's best innovations was to incorporate the strong storytelling of a good dungeon master in the instances when a roll fails. Here, I'm trying to squirm my way out of paying my hotel bill when I fail the roll, and then this happens.
Back so soon.
Had I succeeded, I would have likely just delivered some dialogue and got a free room. In failing the roll, I got a much more worthwhile story out of it. Disco Elysium's roll system continues to provide meaningful, enjoyable failure conditions. In fact, from one perspective, it's actually kind of good when a roll fails, because you get to see the invariably funny or ridiculous failure outcomes, and then later return to re-roll and see the success outcome. Having failure be as meaningful as success is an important lesson in RPG design that I expect many games will emulate in future. Disco Elysium's RPG skill system operates at a far more foundational level than roll checks, however. Indeed, the roll checks are the tip of the iceberg visible to us, where the great mass of it lies well below the waterline. What you'll soon realize as you make your way through conversations and Revachol itself is that your ability to see and do things is dependent on passing invisible stat checks that only surface if you pass the required stat thresholds. Conversation branches are littered with dozens of dialogue options depending on your skill checks. Your skills are constantly being checked to see if they surface the outcome, and if they do, that information is presented to you. If your perception skill is high enough, you may notice an item in the world, or a minor detail about someone's manner or appearance that will lead to dialogue options for you to explore. If your encyclopedia skill is high enough, you may surface some little known fact that might be useful to you in your understanding of the case or the world. The stat and skill choices you make thereby go on to greatly influence your options during a playthrough. It isn't simply about having enough skill points to pass a dice roll, it's about having enough skill points for that specific dice roll to become available at all. Adding further depth to the system is the idea of overinvestment in a stat or a skill. Much like in real life, where singular focus on one thing can lead to detriment, investing too many points into specific skills can result in what we might term negative aberrations. They aren't negative outcomes per se, because they don't inhibit the player in any meaningful way, but they do create situations which, in real life, we'd view negatively. An overinvestment in encyclopedia, for example, can fill your dialogue screen with vast reams of useless information that will annoy you more than help you. Too many points in esprit de corps will see you constantly interrupted by cop scenarios from other precincts, nothing to do with your own case, just random cop anecdotes that feel more like a distraction than anything else. Too many points in empathy and you'll begin to feel the pain of others too poignantly, crying your own tears or grappling with the weight of your own despair. It's a design element that doesn't punish the player, but rather elucidates the cost of too narrow or too deep a specialization. Where other games would erect crude barriers to progression as a price to pay, Disco Elysium is committed to agency and freedom, even when the player makes choices that might go against their own interests. Stepping back and viewing Disco Elysium's RPG systems as a whole, we can't but remark on the brilliance of the framework that has been constructed here. We have an intuitive stat-based system to provide an overall framework to our build. A multifaceted, overlapping set of skills that demands the player intuit their utility and subsequently work to uncover their actual functionality. A series of invisible back-end stat checks determining if dialogue or interaction options become available. A high-stakes roll check system augmenting your base stat builds with the roll of a dice. And finally, a subtly designed feedback mechanism that distorts the player experience when a skill is too heavily invested into without outright disrupting player outcomes. With so many fantastic ideas at play, it's disappointing then that much of the value of these systems is lost due to the lack of genuine choice afforded to the player at almost every junction throughout the game, and how unfulfilling many of the outcomes are when the choice is presented. As you play through Disco Elysium, you'll begin with a feeling that this game must be full of meaningful choice. Huge numbers of branching playthrough paths that will result in radically different outcomes for everyone involved. The reality, though, is very different to this. What you'll find is that while there may be one or two ways for you to complete certain objectives, most objectives have a single way of uncovering or solving them. Finding your gun is the perfect example of this. You'd imagine that with so many different skills at your disposal, the game would offer you at least 5 or 6 different ways for you to retrieve your gun based on the skill build that you have developed. Perhaps you could sweet talk Everett Clare, perhaps wait till after dark and sneak into his office, perhaps lockpick his safe, perhaps threaten his person, perhaps load logically deduce where he might have hidden the gun. Perhaps your powers of perception notice him glance somewhere during a conversation. You could simply reach for it under a pile of papers, etc. Now I know that Everett doesn't have the gun on him, but the point remains. There would have been so many ways for this circumstance to be resolved, and yet the only solution to this is to complete 2 side quests for Everett, whether you want to or not. Players looking to adopt a straight-laced, by-the-book persona who refuse to work for this slimy devil have no chance to retrieve their gun in their playthrough, and that doesn't feel quite right. Measurehead was another disappointment for me. The scabs below indicate that Measurehead was guarding the gate controls and that no one could enter the worksite while he stood guard. So while I wasn't putting any points into my physicality, I put on all my best gear, I took a swig of Al Ghul, and then swung for the fences. Measurehead was down. Great, I thought. I wonder what happens with the scabs below. The answer was nothing. Knocking out Measurehead just gave me access to a few bucks, and that was it. Scabs below recognize for a brief moment that Measurehead has been dealt with, and then they go back to commenting that there's no way for them to get inside. My choice to act here has had no appreciable difference on the world at all, and the choice feels entirely false and pointless. More annoying than this though are the instances of stat checks that require very specific build compositions in order to be effective. The most notable of these is the Shivers check on the billboard to find the location of a suspect. Here I had to pass this check or there was simply no way I could find her. No amount of actual detective work could reveal her to me, and I had to stare at this billboard and then hear the answer on the wind. I had invested no points in Shivers during my entire playthrough, so I was forced to game the system through gear, alcohol, and a few save scums. Eventually I got there, but not before resenting the narrowness of the options on offer here. There are ways to lessen the weight of this stat requirement here, most notably by completing the side quests on the coastal side of the map, but frankly I think this is a weak crutch. When the RPG systems provide this much breadth and flexibility, I think that gameplay checks should offer similar flexibility, otherwise it feels like the RPG systems are being shortchanged, which is exactly what I think is happening in Disco Elysium. Many people will no doubt bristle at this argument and respond that Disco Elysium provides a hitherto unprecedented amount of choice. Every conversation is brimming with options that allow you to carve out vastly different player identities or discover things that other people would never have discovered. There are also freedoms to be had in determining your relationships with others. You can steal the ceramic boots off the corpse and wear them, thereby greatly undermining your relationship with Kim. You can choose to live in the shack across the water, thereby avoiding the need to pay nightly fees at the hotel. You can steal drugs from Kuno's dad and share drugs with a minor. You can adopt political ideologies and expound them during dialogue. This is all true. Disco Elysium does provide the player with a huge amount of choice with regards to how they might comment or decorate their adventure. But the core timeline of events and the solutions required to advance that timeline are painfully singular and painfully rote, and I feel they're completely at odds with the spirit of freedom that this game's broader approach seems to engender. I feel much the same way about the wildly innovative thought system, but for slightly different reasons. Throughout your playthrough, various stat builds and dialogue options will lead you to thoughts, which can then be pondered for a time before being internalized as part of your identity. These things typically provide stat buffs or gameplay bonuses, but they can sometimes result in debuffs as well, such as Superstar Cop, which will result in a loss of logic, since it would clearly require a hefty suspension of disbelief to convince yourself that you're some sort of latent superstar. At a foundational level, I think this system is absolutely genius. My playthrough only uncovered around 1/5 of the total number of thoughts available in the game, indicating that it would take many playthroughs with different build varieties and different dialogue choices to uncover them all. The fact that these thoughts spring so organically from so many different inputs is fascinating. If you didn't go to this exact spot and meet with this exact person and say this exact thing and have this exact composition of stats and skills, you would never have arrived at that thought. This makes each new epiphany feel like it was tailor-made for you and your playstyle, and it allows you to deepen an idea that was clearly already incepted by some means, as though the developers could sense your inner fascist and just decided to feed it by giving it a label and a stat bonus. There's a renaissance quality to the thought system, tugging simultaneously at intellectualism, imagination, political identity, existentialism, artistic composition, and linguistic cleverness. At one point, you want to inspect the much decayed corpse hanging outside, but a failed roll check sees you vomit your guts up. Kim tells you that you need to get your shit together. Suddenly, a thought emerges. Volumetric shit compressor. A thought that converts Kim's more colloquial terminology into something more technical and has the added benefit of increasing your chance of passing the corpse inspection roll check the next time around. It's a fusion of character dialogue, gameplay outcomes, RPG design, and clever wordplay that is intellectually rewarding for the player who can see it for what it is. The thoughts are not limited to single-use effects though. I internalized the Hobocop thought early in my journey, and throughout my playthrough noted multiple dialogue options that wouldn't have existed had I not made this choice. This is further augmented by your skill choices. Here, my Hobocop thought combined with my heavy investment in visual calculus to reveal that this boat could be used as shelter. I could stay there without needing to spend any money at the hotel anymore. Had I not internalized Hobocop and not put enough points into visual calculus, I never would have seen this. This puts the odds of another player discovering this at pretty low, and is therefore going to make subsequent playthroughs all the more rewarding for the surprising discoveries players will bump into. When I first began seeing how the thought system was all mapped out, I'd assumed it would create a sort of perk tree that would allow me to develop or refine certain builds. This is partly true, but not in the way that I had imagined. It's true that each thought does come with a specific set of bonuses or debuffs, and that these contribute to a build, and it's true that these thoughts open up dialogue options that would otherwise be unavailable. But these stat bonuses are so minor, and these dialogue options are so inconsequential, that the thought system has very little impact on your overall playthrough. You could completely ignore this system and still progress through every part of the game without any difficulty. It is very auxiliary. This is not a bad thing, mind you. Rather than load up yet another complicated game system on top of an already complex and freewheeling RPG foundation, the thought system feels more like color, more exploration, more indulgence, and more imagination. I think this is its principal utility, sparking your imagination. You can imagine your detective to be a hobo, a libertarian, a fascist, a communist, an artist, a run-of-the-mill cop, a superstar cop, a political centrist, a sexist, a nationalist, a racial supremacist, the list goes on. Each of these choices will subtly influence gameplay, but they play a far more pertinent role in influencing your own concept of the character you are building for yourself, deepening your roleplay experience without relying on traditional RPG systems. This concept of identity building is further enforced by the diametrically opposed nature of many of the thought options. At one point, I had internalized both libertarianism and communism, with each of these providing me gameplay rewards when I selected dialogue options aligned with these. The thing is, I can only select one dialogue option, so having two thoughts competing for the same action was a wasted investment. I promptly forgot the communist thought and committed myself further to the libertarian cause. Through smart and subtle design, the game was edging me towards a declared identity without ever forcing me to make binary decisions. Of all of Disco Elysium's many innovations, the thought system feels like the best. Part of me wishes that it would have had more impact on gameplay outcomes than it currently does, but I think this desire comes from the lack of choice inherent in the core game design rather than any shortcoming in the thought system itself. The system could have been more impactful, but it probably shouldn't have been. It feels rather perfect as it is. One area where Disco Elysium has been universally praised is in its exploration of political themes, specifically ideologies like communism, libertarianism, capitalism, and fascism, nationhood, nationalism, colonization, as well as social issues such as equality, racism, and sexism. Like much of Disco Elysium, I'm glad these things exist in the game, but I'm frustrated how limited their implementation is and how little agency they afford the player. Disco Elysium is clearly a politically charged game. Its very setting speaks to a post-communist collapse that echoes what Soviet vassal states would have endured with the fall of communism in the 1990s, with emergent capitalism establishing an oligarchy where labor is oppressed with an almost reactionary vengeance. The geography of Revachol seems to tell this story itself. The right side of the map is a fully industrial shipyard with an enthroned magnate, and the left side of the map has fallen into utter poverty and ruin, where God has been forsaken and all the men have left. The island to the north is a communist bastion excised from space and time. The events which serve as a backdrop to the murder echo the class struggle afoot. Organized labor fights for their rights, but in cynical, opportunistic terms set down by the corrupt union boss. Capitalist interests ruthlessly pursue an end to the industrial action no matter the cost. Scab workers demand their right to work. Out-of-work truck drivers have nowhere else to go. Local business is collapsing as fewer and fewer people remain. Old soldiers and locals hold onto the memories of the past, knowing that there are no better times ahead. Against this backdrop, emerging and conflicting social trends are inserted. Kuno is a displaced youth with no respect for authority. The drug trade is rife throughout the area. Young people turn to gangs and crime for both acceptance and survival. Racism is omnipresent owing to the cosmopolitan nature of the coalition government. Sexism is also a thing, though no one really seems to bring that to the table except you. I certainly give Disco Elysium credit for being willing to tackle these issues. In an era where game developers are terrified to tackle anything that could be even considered political, Disco Elysium wraps its arms around as many political topics as it can, and it charges headlong into the fray. As a backdrop, these issues both broaden the world and appeal to the player's intelligence. What's not present when discussing most of these topics, however, is the nuance that might make for a more meaningful exploration of the subject matter. Earlier, I commented that Disco Elysium was not worried about the scale of an idea, only its extremism or its absurdity, and that centrist views feel rather out of place. This is writ large across the game's political discourse, where most of it is so polar, so extreme, that it can only be read as caricature. Kuno may represent displaced youth left by the wayside, but his character is so over the top as to feel ridiculous. Everett is so slimy and duplicitous that his puppeteering of the labor movement feels cartoonish. The very demands of the union that every union member be made a member of the company board, they're beyond outlandish, and they make unions look every bit as recalcitrant as capitalist propaganda make them out to be. The youths turning to drugs manufacturing are equally obsessed with setting up a nightclub in a church as they are pursuing some spiritual journey to find the perfect beat. All of this feels overdone and unreal. The most disruptive element in the political discourse, however, is the player themselves. Or more precisely, the dialogue options provided to the player when navigating political and social issues. There are a limited number of centrist dialogue options, but typically the player is forced into very extreme positions. There's no aspects of communism are good, but I don't agree with the wholesale implementation of it. There's only eat the rich or down with the proletariat. There's really nothing in between, and that makes a thoughtful exploration of the political ideologies very difficult. Similarly, on the topics of racism and sexism, the game is only interested in absurdity. Now, to be clear, racism and sexism are absurd, and there's nothing wrong with highlighting this fact. Measurehead's name is a reference to the antiquated process of measuring the proportions of a human head to predict their traits and intelligence with a strong bias against non-white, non-Christian, non-Europeans. Measurehead's entire racial philosophy is based on ludicrous historical legend and eugenics, a long discredited pseudoscience grounded in racism. It's all absurd, which means that it's easily laughed at, but it doesn't prompt any reflection on the topic of racism. The same can be said about the game's handling of sexism. No character in the game demonstrates an overt sexism, except for the player, who is occasionally just offered sexist lines of dialogue, like, "I hate women." If you choose these, thought perks open up, and you're offered more and more dialogue options, allowing you to express your hatred for the other sex. It's funny, it's silly, but it similarly does not say anything meaningful about the nature of sexism or its impact on people. Now again, to be clear, I'm not asking for Disco Elysium to offer up a sympathetic take on racism and sexism. I'm simply saying that Disco Elysium uses these things as backdrops and window dressing without prompting us to fully engage these topics. My comments here are a response to the praise that Disco Elysium is receiving for being a thought-provoking, politically charged game. I don't agree with that. I think Disco Elysium uses its themes as either a world-building tool or a way to get a few cheap laughs here and there. Besides dialogue options not providing a compelling window into social or political issues, gameplay choices and outcomes achieve even less. The thought system allows you to internalize an idea, and I think this is an important word, internalize, because while the player can internalize these ideas, they cannot externalize them in any meaningful way. They can say fascist, communist, sexist, or racist stuff, but their words have very little impact on the world around them. The player cannot, for example, align with Titus in solidarity with the working man and end the strike on the union's terms. They can't side with the Wild Pines representative and end the strike on capitalist terms. There is a specific dialogue exchange where the player frames the strike as a class war and declares a side, but this war only exists in the player's mind. The Wild Pines representative herself just waves this off. You cannot align yourself with a communist cell and agitate for another revolution. You cannot work for Rene and elevate him to some fascist dictatorship. You cannot even be a racist or a sexist in a way that actually means anything. You cannot discriminate against someone in a way that will affect gameplay outcomes. You can say dumb stuff, but that person will typically just ignore it. You can be as racist as you like at every possible turn, and Kim will still never leave your side. He'll just make some little comment at the end of the game that, like, you're a little bit racist. While Disco Elysium's writing invokes political and social themes, I find these themes better delivered on in other games. Choosing to align with the Brotherhood of Steel in the Fallout games is a statement of political intent, that you value the authoritarian, military dictatorship style of order that the Brotherhood imposes. Dragon Age's many decision points, particularly as regards to the role of mages in society, provoke deeper introspection on the nature of discrimination than Disco Elysium ever achieves. The Outer Worlds provides a comedic but still thought-provoking commentary on capitalism, as players are forced to choose between the order and stability it brings versus the uncertainty of a communal economic existence. When gameplay decisions bring me close to these subjects and force me to choose, they also force me to think. Disco Elysium's static and unchanging world does not allow for this, rendering all of its political and social commentary rather hollow, but also perfectly in keeping with its existential bent. We'll come back to that later. There's a debate raging about Disco Elysium as to whether or not the game is a CRPG or a point-and-click adventure game with RPG elements. CRPGs are your Baldur's Gates, your Icewind Dales, your Planescape Torments, your Pillars of Eternity, and your Divinity Original Sins. Point-and-click adventure games are best summarized under two developers: LucasArts, who delivered us a golden age with the likes of Full Throttle and Escape from Monkey Island and a whole bunch of others, and Telltale, who resurrected this genre with their Walking Dead series before eventually collapsing under the weight of overcommitment and a lack of innovation. The definitions don't really matter though. Disco Elysium is both an RPG and a point-and-click adventure game. So let's focus on the adventure game side of its formula and ask, is Disco Elysium a good adventure game? I would say, no, it is not. I think the story of Disco Elysium is very mundane, and I became quite frustrated and bored by it toward the end. It starts brilliantly as the mystery of the world and your vanished memory set the scene, but the more you uncover about the case, the more ho-hum it turns out to be. As far as detective stories go, this one is largely free of twists and turns and ends very badly. Were it not for the cast of characters and side quests, I would have enjoyed Disco Elysium much less than I actually did. I think my disappointment with with the unfolding of events can be traced to a few key moments. I've mentioned a few already when I talked about how the pivotal choices offered by the game aren't really choices at all and will generally result in similar playthroughs for each player. More broadly, I feel as though this is a game of two halves, and I mean that literally, like literally two halves. The first 2 days are spent on the right side of the map and they are gripping. Every character and every story seems to connect directly to the murder case. It feels so tight and intertwined. Across the bridge, the entire region feels like padding and busy work. Go on a date with some woman, find the old man's jacket, go help some kids move into the church, help them find cool music, help the programmer inside get her data cube back, help the crab man do something or other. All of it felt so unnecessary, and given that all of this brought the progress of the main case to a crawl, I was really frustrated by this. This next section contains spoilers. Skip ahead to the time on screen to avoid these. We're going to go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here we go. All of this culminates in a hugely disappointing ending. The foundation of a good detective story is fairness to the audience. The audience needs to have a reasonable shot at piecing together the mystery themselves. There needs to be breadcrumbs left for the discerning viewer so that they can carry their suspicions with them throughout the journey, buttressing or discarding their theory as more information is presented until the moment of truth arrives and they can say, "Aha! I knew it all along." Disco Elysium's ending is the exact opposite of this. Not only was the crime not committed by anyone you knew, with a murder weapon you never encountered, but they did it from a place you literally could not even reach until the game's climax, and their motive was almost non-existent. Jealousy? Really? This old communist relic had a hard-on for a stripper? That's what we worked 20 hours to discover? No, that ending sucks. When I say that I didn't love Disco Elysium, there are a few reasons for that, but its ending is chief among them. I really struggle with how little Disco Elysium draws upon my detective skills and allows me to deduce things on my own. The adventure game genre, above all other genres, is the one that has most enabled the player to embody a detective, combing through environments to find hidden clues and combining things you find to solve puzzles and advance. The truth is, there is no problem solving whatsoever in Disco Elysium. Every single thing you need to do is explained to you in the starkest of terms. At one point, I find a clipboard with a hidden compartment that contains a piece of paper. The ink is invisible. It might have been a chance for me to search far and wide for a light that might do the trick. Perhaps a black light in a room somewhere, and through my own gumption, I figure out that if I use this exact item at that exact space, I can read the hidden words. But no, Kim just tells me that I can read the words using the headlights on his car. I go over there, I pull it out, done. In Disco Elysium, the process of being a detective isn't about deducing anything. It's actually just about clicking on everything you see. Everything in the world, every person you see, every dialogue option that appears. That's how you be a good detective in Disco Elysium. You just click on all the things. Given how much scope there would have been for adventure game style puzzle solving, this feels like a really big missed opportunity. Despite this, Disco Elysium does offer compelling mysteries that will hold your attention. Kim Kutsuragi is his own Pandora's box of secrets, and every interaction with him feels so rewarding. The Doom Commercial District storyline is like 5 mysteries all piled into one. Even the doorbell outside the district is its own mini mystery. Pressing each of its buttons feels like spinning a mystery roulette wheel. There's the mystery of the cryptids and those people hunting them. The real reason why Everett wants to build that youth center over there. Who's running the drugs and why? How did Kuno get so fucked up, and is there any saving this kid? While Disco Elysium comprehensively fails to deliver a compelling detective sim, it excels in delivering mysteries that beg to be solved. Disco Elysium is not a good adventure game, which is a shame because it could have been. Luckily, it's salvaged by its incredibly consistent writing, imagination, and its RPG. Just as we asked if Disco Elysium is a good adventure game, we can and should ask if it's a good RPG. As I've explained above, my general position on this is that Disco Elysium's RPG systems are brilliantly constructed, but the overall framework does not let these systems shine as brightly as they otherwise could if more meaningful choice was possible and the world more malleable to that choice. My critique here really comes from a traditional video game based view of how RPG systems should work, where the systems either produce or don't produce specific outcomes for the player. It's a very mechanical view of RPG design. Instead, I think it's far better to evaluate Disco Elysium's RPG in the context of the literal definition of the term role-playing game. We can then ask, is Disco Elysium good at letting me inhabit a role, to role-play a character? And the answer to that is, this is probably the best role-playing game I have ever played. No other game on the market feels as close to the verbose, indulgent, imaginative, unhinged madness of a real-life pen and paper RPG. No game to this point has managed to recreate so faithfully the voice of the dungeon master, simultaneously guiding you through an adventure while throwing up roadblocks at every turn, cheering you on for your victories and mocking you mercilessly for your failures, twisting and turning to keep pace with your improvisation while subtly steering you to the predetermined milestones they've laid down. In Disco Elysium, this voice isn't singular. It is in fact 24 different voices, with each of your skills being their own chatty companion residing in your head. They're rather like 24 different characters, each with their own personality and preferences, and they each guide you when it's necessary. When interrogating a witness, my inner voice tells me what this person would or would not want to hear, and I ignore this advice at my peril. The voices also regularly tussle with one another. Here, my inland empire is trying to convince me that this whole case could be cracked wide open by this simple coffee cup, but my logic retorts that this is highly unlikely. There is a dialogue going on in my head all the time, and it's not just a question of which of my friends I choose to put points into, but who I listen to at any given moment. This constant stimulation and suggestion, this constant alignment and realignment, is itself a process of role play, as I choose which parts of my psyche I will empower or suppress, listen to or ignore. I can't control the inner monologue, but I can decide who I side with, and in those decisions, I begin to define who I am. This process of self-definition is the most important and arguably the only agency that Disco Elysium affords the player. You cannot much influence events, and you cannot at all influence the world. You can only define who you are. I can be a slave to my addictions if I choose to be, or I can try and go straight. I can agree to kill a kid's dad for drugs, or I can try and reform that kid. I can play the crooked cop who accepts bribes from whoever is offering, or I can strike a strong moral pose. I can internalize the fiction of my own superstardom, or I can become the sorry cop, defined most by my constant apologizing. But it's not just stat and skill choices that define who you are, and it's not just the decisions you make. It's also about the characters you choose to inhabit at a given moment. I can roleplay John Cleese in Monty Python absurdity and convince a woman that her husband is missing even before he's officially missing. He actually does turn out to be missing, funnily enough. I can roleplay Bill Murray in Ghostbusters and cynically impersonate a paranormal detective in the commercial district. I can sing karaoke when it's real late and when no one's around to hear it, because no one should be forced to hear this.
I would often go there to the tiny church there.
There's a lot of mystery in Disco Elysium, but the most compelling mystery of all is who you are. You can try and solve for that answer, like understanding your history as a cop, how many people you've killed, how old you are, Dora and why she left you, but none of these stories are as meaningful as the story that you yourself are creating as you inhabit the role of the detective. No other game I've ever played has given me this much freedom to define who I am and be that person, which is the very essence of roleplay. We might conclude by asking if Disco Elysium is a strong existential text. It's an important question because depending on your appetite for answering it, many of the game's biggest weaknesses, such as the lack of choice and the disappointing ending, can be reconciled. I'm not going to go too deep into existential philosophy, but let's just summarize it by saying that who we are as people is not predetermined, and that we define ourselves through a process of observation as we make rationally based decisions in a fundamentally irrational and absurd world. We might think we're a good person, but if we shoplift regularly, there's a good chance that we aren't a good person. Similarly, we might like to think that things happen for a reason, or that leading a good life will lead to good outcomes for you, but the reality is it's all just pot luck and you could get hit by a car tomorrow. Any world in which nothing really matters and horrible things can happen to people for no reason whatsoever is at least a little bit absurd. In existentialism, defining oneself through action is the only way to draw any meaning from a world devoid of it. Given this definition, we might argue that any RPG is an existential text, and that's partly true. Our choices and actions do define us in those games. Where most RPGs deviate from existential philosophy, however, is in the rules-based causality underpinning the choices you make. Remember earlier where I commented that games like Fallout, Dragon Age, and Outer Worlds allow us to impress our will upon the world, that our decisions will have a meaningful impact? That's a decidedly non-existential worldview. Disco Elysium has what I would call a masochistic commitment to existentialism. The only real choice you have as a player are the decisions that you make about yourself. You are totally free to exist in any way you choose and express that existence in any way you like, so long as that expression does not require the world to respond to it. Revachol is the quintessential existential planescape. Built on the ashes of failed communist optimism, governed ineffectively by coalition, full of characters too ridiculous to reconcile, paralyzed by absurd union demands, imperiled by capitalist response. None of this makes any sense, and it stands to reason that a place built on such absurdity shouldn't bend to your will should you just finish a few side quests and solve a murder. In this way, the lack of choice and consequence elicited from the RPG systems is perfectly in keeping with Disco Elysium's existential themes. This next section also contains spoilers. Skip ahead to the time on screen to avoid these. We're going in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here we go. Existentialism can also justify or at least explain Disco Elysium's ending. So rarely does police work result in Grisham-worthy page-turners. It's typically the husband who done it, and more recently these days, it is the gun-wielding madman just indiscriminately killing without any explanation. Crime itself often conforms with existentialism, so why should it be any different in Disco Elysium? The perpetrator wasn't hiding in plain sight, he was hiding on a distant island. He didn't perform the act up close, he did it through a rifle scope a kilometer away. The developers had the chance to supply him with a grand, unifying motive, one that tied together the communist revolution, the labor crisis, the poverty of the area, the displaced fascism, the morass of the present times, and the pessimism of the future. These things were all discussed in your exchange with the deserter, but none of these things were the actual motive. What was it? He's old. He's crazy, and he had a crush on a woman. What could possibly be more existential than all of that wasted world building, exposition, and detective work? So, there you have it. Disco Elysium is an existential text, case closed. The reveal of the stick insect came as a pretty big surprise to me. The game had hitherto been rather strict in its adherence to not only reality, but to a very unsurprising version of it. I'd filed the whole cryptid storyline away in my mind as like another red herring aimed to provide color to an otherwise dreary world. But here it was, standing at full height before me, and not only that, I could touch it, take a photo of it, commune with it. Clearly, this isn't an existential world after all. The world is full of wonder hiding in plain sight if you dare to see it. The world is a fairy tale waiting to be believed in. And not only that, but I, among all other people, have been chosen to see it. And not just that, but Kim can only look silently on as I fulfill my destiny and speak with this creature. The universe is not absurd or without reason. Instead, it conspires in my redemption arc. All of the universe exists for me and me alone to interpret. I am God. Is this moment a betrayal of Disco Elysium's existential message? A lazy attempt to spice up what is an otherwise disappointing finale? A final optimistic gasp against 20 hours of nothingness? Or is it just a non sequitur meant to make us second guess our conclusions about Disco Elysium's message? Neither the questions nor the answers really matter. I spent a lot of time in this review nitpicking the minor elements of Disco Elysium's design, and I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning of this video. I only do that because this game is so good, so thought-provoking, so innovative, that it deserves as much analysis as we can throw at it. There are things to be learned from every part of this game. Some of those lessons are what to avoid, but the overwhelming majority of what's on offer here is a tour de force of inspired game design and writing. Disco Elysium is an instant classic, and one that will go on to influence RPGs for years to come. Not since Planescape Torment have we seen a CRPG as influential as this, and to think that it came from a tiny developer making their first ever game, that's a very humbling thought. Guys, Christmas time is upon us, and I can think of no better gift than Displate. Displates are metal posters that attach to your walls with the power of magnets. They're easy to take down, swap around, and do all sorts of crazy shit with. I have like 3 dozen Displates because I'm always just kind of switching them around at the layman office, but here at home, I'm rocking the Witcher stuff at the moment purely because the Netflix series is out and I'm just, you know, watching it and I'm like all about that Witcher life. I have some Cyberpunk stuff as well. I'll bring that home next year when that time comes. Displate ships to dozens and dozens of countries, and you'll typically get your package in just a few short days. When you do, you'll love them because they're so easy to put up and they look great. They're like posters of the future. I think that's what we'll go with. Futuristic posters. Click the link in the description below to visit my list of some of the best gaming Displates on the site, and either use the Christmas code they have going right now or use the offer code SKILLUP at checkout to get a discount. Thanks Displate for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it.